Israel was a free people. They had been released from 400 years of slavery by their God, who heard their groaning and remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God rescued them, bore them on eagle's wings, and brought them to Himself, and then bound Himself to them as their Lord and their God. We've been talking about in the beginning for several weeks, and this is a different kind of beginning. This was the beginning of Israel's life as God's elect. No longer were they a mere means of production. They were a people. No longer were they a resource to be consumed. They were God's covenant treasure, His holy nation who He loved. But they were not only free from slavery, but free for the purposes of God. And now, in Deuteronomy, after a period of wandering in the wilderness, this freedom from and freedom for was about to reach its climax. The book of Deuteronomy is Moses' final sermon, or series of sermons, to the generation of Israelites who were permitted to enter the promised land. This is the high point in the biblical story so far. Israel stands a stone's throw away from 700 years of promise, just beyond the Jordan, opposite Canaan. God had been faithful to His word. He had brought them to this land, a land that He says the Lord your God is giving you for all time, and a land in which their lives would be changed forever. They would adopt an agricultural way of life as opposed to a nomadic one. Tools that they once used to support the economy of an oppressor would now be used to work and keep a place of their own. They would no longer have to ask permission to worship their Lord, but could do so at their pleasure. This is the land of promise. And in this land, the people of Israel could be God's free people. Anytime you or I are reading the Scriptures, one of the questions we should return to again and again is, what, if anything, does this passage or story or law or whatever say about God? There's any number of reasons for that. The main reason is that it keeps us focused on the Bible's main character. In the beginning was who? God. And one of the truths about God that leaps off the pages in the opening books of the Bible is that God is a God of freedom. It is important to Him and defines a great deal of what He does. He creates the cosmos in and with freedom. He had no reason to beyond the fact that He wanted to. What He creates, He then gives freedom, even at the risk of disobedience. God also fights for freedom, whether it is Israel in the 13th century BC or black people in 19th century America. God works to free people from the things and people who enslave them. God also wants His people to experience and participate in that freedom that comes from Him. Time and time again, His instruction to His people is in order that, as He says, it may go well with you, that you may live into this life that you've been freed to, that you may appreciate it, enjoy it, and be made whole by it. How did He expect Israel to do this? How does He expect you to do this, and me? Is there a practice or a discipline that we can do to regularly reinforce the fact that by God's grace we are free, never to be enslaved again? There is, and it's a practice we began to discuss last week. Our scripture this morning comes from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 5. I'll be reading verses 12 through 15. Moses writes, "Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant, or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, so that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." This is the word of the Lord. This passage should sound both familiar and unfamiliar. There are two versions of the Ten Commandments in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The first is in Exodus 20, and the second is here in Deuteronomy 5. They are almost identical, with a couple of important exceptions. The first is the rationale, or the why, concerning this fourth commandment, Sabbath observance. The explanation in Exodus is what we heard last week. Israel was to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Why? For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. God rested in the very good world that He created, delighting in the work of His hands. And our entry point into that very good world is to enjoy it as God enjoys it, separating time as holy time, to rest as God rests. But now, 40 years later, if you're thinking chronologically, Moses offers a different explanation. Did you hear it? Deuteronomy 5, verse 15. Why do we stop? Why do we stop for the Sabbath? You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Why the shift? Why would Moses change his tone? Several years ago, my younger brother and I were helping my grandparents, Dane and Grandmama, as we affectionately call them, move from Lafayette, Alabama, to our hometown in Huntsville, Texas. And John, if he were here, I'd say this and might even be meaner about it, in typical fashion, helped do the bare minimum before leaving to go to some social engagement. So really, I helped them move to Texas. They lived in that house for 30 years, lived in that house for longer than I've been alive. And any of you who've moved out of a house with that much history know how hard it is to make that move, even if you're excited for what comes next. I remember sitting in the room that we practically grew up in when we visited them twice a year, that my family would stay in, and just crying. I was glad they were moving closer to family, but closing the book on something like that is hard. Took a lap around the big yard. They had this steep hill in their backyard that was connected to a ramp that led up to the porch that we would fly down on tricycles, sometimes crashing and burning, but what doesn't kill you only makes you stronger. It was a time of intense nostalgia, but that nostalgia was killed dead when we were waiting for Grandmama to finish cleaning out the freezer. Oh, I could have killed her. Her husband could have too. They're both still alive, by the way, so if they watch this, I remember. Piece by piece, she would take something out of the freezer, and we were getting ready to go stay with some family friends before we made our trip to Texas. Their name, or her name, was Jane Ann. So one at a time, some unrecognizable frozen substance. Maybe Jane Ann would want to keep that. Grab another one. Okay, maybe she'll want to keep this one. Grab some ice cream that's months past its expiration date. Well, you know, it's not going to hurt anybody. Time and time again. And I'm sitting there. I've gotten all my crying out of my system just thinking, what are you doing? But Grandmama was self-aware. It's actually that self-awareness that makes this story all the more frustrating, because she's just doing this nonsense. And she finally, without even looking up, says, "I'm sure y'all are wondering what I'm doing." And my grandfather, in his token, quick punchline wit, says, "Well, what are you doing?" And she explained, "I just didn't want to let any of this food go to waste. It seemed so wrong to do that." And I said, "Well, Grandmama, we've got a move to make. Sometimes, whether it seems wrong or not, you just got to throw the food away," I said in my youthful hubris. And some of you who've battled with me during this church cleanup day will appreciate what comes next. Looking at you, Miss Simmons. Grandmama looks at me and she says, "Son, when you have lived through a depression, you never just throw stuff away." It is easy for the young to lose sight of the hardships of those who came before us. In my privilege, and it is privilege with a capital P, I took for granted something that my grandparents, many around the world as we speak, many of you perhaps, once struggled to attain. Food. Just toss it. We can get it anytime we want it, anywhere we want it. We have no idea how lucky we are. The Deuteronomy generation was the first generation to grow up in Exodus freedom. They did not know a day of slavery. And even if some of them were alive back then, they were far too young to remember. Their parents, on the contrary, had been slaves. The same goes for their grandparents and their great-grandparents and their great-great-grandparents. 400 years. Slaves to a brutal, oppressive empire that commodified them and exploited them, grinding their bodies down, John Mark Comer writes, quote, "until there's nothing left but ash and dust." They were, in the literal sense of the phrase, worked to death. These slaves were not even allowed to stop and worship. In fact, when the enslaved Israelites did have the nerve to ask for some time to worship the Lord in the wilderness, Pharaoh accused them of growing idle and gave them more work to do. You know, since they had so much time on their hands. This was a miserable life. And Sabbath was to be rooted in God's salvation of His people from this life. It was a day, indeed the day, to remember where they came from and live into that newfound freedom. A day for each new generation to rehearse the story of the Exodus, and then to rest because they could rest, and then stop because they could stop. And, by the way, let their servants rest, because they were never going to be slave drivers if they knew what their parents had suffered under those same people. Never taking for granted again what God had given them. It's funny to me, and I don't know if it's funny to y'all, that keeping a day like this is a commandment. And apparently a commandment they have to mention more than once. I mean, it sounds like a gift, right? Can you imagine being commanded to receive a gift? Here, son, here's $100. Use it however you want it. No, I don't want it. What? Tate, it's $100. Just take the $100. No, keep your $100. Tate, if you don't take and spend this $100, you're done, dude. Get out. Okay, fine. I guess I'll take the $100. What a pity that we have to be commanded to accept a gift. And Sabbath rest is a gift. Jesus knew this. In a famous dispute about the do's and don'ts of Sabbath observance, Jesus says the Sabbath was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. God made this day for you. to rejoice and be glad in Him, and to experience and participate in the freedom that comes from Him. What a wonderful gift this is. Once a week, we are given an opportunity by God to simply stop. The Hebrew word Shabbat, where we get Sabbath from, just means to stop. And it is at this point that I think we often ask the right questions in the wrong order. What do you wonder, most of you, when you hear about Sabbath stopping? For most of us, I can't speak for all of us, I think the first question generally is, what do we stop from? What should I not do? Part of that's your upbringing. We talked about that last week. For most of you, Sabbath was sanctified punishment. It was a holy day, but it felt like you were grounded. So you can't help it. But it is an important question. What should we stop from? And we'll address it in a moment. But Sabbath is a gift, not a shackle. Our first question should be, what do we stop for? What do I do on the Sabbath day? Worship, of course. We said last week, don't call it a Sabbath if it's not built around worship. Just call it a day off. But after that, the ball's in your court. What fills you with joy? What stirs your heart to gratitude? What do you like? What can you fill your Sabbath day with that leaves you feeling healthy and whole? That leaves you feeling filled with the Holy Spirit? For where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And the Sabbath day is a gift given to us in order to be free. And that is a gift worth protecting tooth and nail. There is one more difference between the Exodus version of the fourth commandment and the one here in Deuteronomy. In Exodus, the people of Israel are instructed to remember, Hebrew, zachar, the Sabbath day. Now that word remember has kind of a pious meaning. It refers to setting something apart as sacred, to meditate on it. One very literal translation even says to burn incense on that day. All this is what we said last week. The main way we remember the Sabbath in the biblical sense is to worship on the Sabbath. In Deuteronomy, however, Moses doesn't say remember, and that difference is not semantics. He tells this generation to observe, Hebrew shamar, the Sabbath. Shamar is a defensive word. The translation observe actually, in my opinion, dilutes the meaning. It refers to guarding something, to protecting something, preserving it from infectious influences. We could translate Deuteronomy 5:12 very literally to say, protect the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. Guard it with your life. Set up a barbed wire fence around it so that anything that would try to trespass upon your Sabbath does so at its own peril. But what am I protecting against? What are we guarding this day from? What are we guarding ourselves from? This is our second question, remember? Now we get to answer it. What am I stopping from? The short of it is the things you've been freed from. We said earlier that Israel had been freed from being a mere means of production and a people to be consumed. Civilized society had, as it continues to do now, commodified them. They were not a people. They were laborers to be used and exhausted in the name of stimulating the economy. That seems like a good starting place for us too. The reason we do not work on the Sabbath is not because of some kind of do-nothing legalism, but because working all the time is the stuff of slaves. That's what slaves do. For many of us, this has to be. step one in building a Sabbath. Once a week, stop working. Stop it. Reminds me of this SNL skit of these kids who are looking for some kind of educated therapist to help them with their problems, and they get so frustrated because the therapist just keeps saying, well, stop it. Well, yeah, but I really need to... No, just stop it. But I can hear the protests. Don't be naive, Andrew. Kid. Some of us can't afford to just stop. Or classic preacher's jokes. Not everyone works just twice a week. For some of us, time is money. Is it? In 2020, just last year, the average individual fast food restaurant within the top 200 franchises did $700,000 in revenue. Taco Bell, $700,000. McDonald's, $700,000. Burger King, $700,000. McDonald's, though, did much better than that. They are, of course, the gold standard of fast food. Each McDonald's franchise did $2.6 million per restaurant in 2020. So really, McDonald's, $2.5 million. Leagues higher than the industry average. The cream of the crop. And then there's Chick-fil-A. They're in the top 200. Though they are the only one of that top 200 that is closed on Sunday. That's a 52-week disadvantage, or 52-day disadvantage, excuse me. But not just any day, Sunday, which for most restaurants, fast food and sit-down, is their best day of the week financially. That's when they make their most money, their most profits. Do you know how much the average Chick-fil-A restaurant made in 2020? Not the organization, each restaurant. Remember, McDonald's open 7 days a week, some 24 hours, $2.6 million. Chick-fil-A's average, try $7 million. Tell me again how time is money. And if that isn't compelling, then some of you just need to listen to your bodies. Some of us need to just listen to our bodies. Why is it that the people who refuse to stop working are often the most numb, the most uncreative, the most restless? Why is it that workaholism seems to have a direct relationship with anger, cynicism, anxiety, and a lack of physical or emotional intimacy? Some of you know all too well the way that this life affects our immune and our nervous systems. We get more colds than we usually did and blow out our backs in the process. Could it be that God is sending us a message? You can't keep this up. And you were never meant to keep this up. Then there are those of us who can pat ourselves on the back because we're not consumed by work. But we might just be consumed by consumption. Marketing experts and social media designers are literally manipulating your and my chemical makeup. Every purchase we make on Amazon, every like we get on Instagram, releases a neurotransmitter into our bloodstream called dopamine. Does that sound familiar? It's the same sense of pleasure released when you get high. And there are people whose sole job is to make you want to come in and take another hit, to submit again and again to their enslaving yoke. And we often let them. Well, how do I know if this is where I'm at? How do I know if I'm enslaved to such things? Do you buy something when you get sad? When your self-esteem is low, do you post a picture or an inspiring quote to get likes and reactions? That, brothers and sisters, is not retail therapy. That is the stuff of addiction, a most insidious kind of slavery. And don't you want to be free from that? And don't you want to protect that freedom? Because the truth is, you are free. I don't think it is a coincidence that the New Testament frequently speaks of salvation in terms of being freed from slavery. Romans chapter 6 and Galatians chapter 5 are good starting points here. The Exodus was a paradigmatic event for many of the biblical authors. It shaped their imaginations and the way they articulated what Jesus accomplished for all of us. Jesus Christ has led us on a mass exodus out from under the whip of sin. Our freedom is secured. That is not what's in question. What we need is the same reminder received by the Deuteronomy generation. God has given us all a day that He commands us to observe, in which we remember our salvation and refuse to ever again submit to the yoke of slavery. Sabbath observance is our first line of defense against the multifaceted, enslaving influence that our culture throws at us on a regular basis. It is a weekly declaration of freedom, that I am free, that you are free, free to stop working, free to stop buying, free to be satisfied and content, to drink from the rich well of ordinary life. By the discipline of Sabbath observance, we integrate salvation into our bones, declaring not just with our mouths, but with our lives, that we are free in the Son of God, Jesus Christ, and who the Son sets free is free indeed.